The transport ship landed on Nesser Prime with a heavy thud that shook the metal floor beneath the feet of every soldier inside. And when the doors opened, bright white sunlight flooded the cabin and made everyone squint their eyes against the harsh glare of an alien sun. Private First Class Elena Vasquez stood near the back of the group, her shoulders relaxed and her face showing nothing as she watched her fellow human soldiers file out onto the landing platform where representatives from a dozen different alien species waited to greet them. The Joint Galactic Military Academy was the most famous training facility in the known galaxy. And for 400 years, it had produced the finest marksmen and combat specialists from 17 different species. And now, for the first time in history, a small group of humans had been invited to participate in the annual interspecies combat trials. Elena carried a long case in her right hand, the surface covered in scratches and dents and held together in places with strips of adhesive tape that looked almost comical next to the sleek metallic weapons cases the other soldiers carried. She was not tall and she was not short, and her dark hair was pulled back from her face in a simple knot, and there was nothing about her appearance that would make anyone look twice, which was exactly the way she preferred it. Sergeant Kethril of the Verdani species stood at the edge of the platform with his arms crossed over his broad chest, his compound eyes moving independently as they tracked each human that stepped off. The transport, the Verdani, were legendary marksmen and had been for thousands of years, before humans had even learned to make tools from stone. And Kethril was considered one of the finest shooters his people had produced in 3 generations. He watched the humans with something between amusement and pity, because he had seen their weapons technology and he knew that they were still using systems that the Verdani had abandoned as primitive long before human civilization had begun. Next to him stood a Thessari cadet whose name was Vrex and whose skin was covered in bioluminescent stripes that flickered with different colors depending on his mood. And right now those stripes were pulsing with a soft blue light that indicated he was trying not to laugh. "Look at them," Rex said quietly so that only Kethril could hear. "They move like they think they belong here, but everyone knows humans are the youngest species in the Alliance, and their military technology is centuries behind everyone else." Kethril made a sound that might have been agreement and continued watching as the humans were led toward the equipment inspection area, where every participant in the trials was required to present their weapons for official registration. The inspection area was a large open space with tables arranged in rows and alien officials standing behind each one with scanning equipment ready to catalog every weapon that would be used in the competition. Elena waited in line with patience that seemed endless while cadets from other species pushed past her or made comments about humans that they did not bother to keep quiet. And through all of it, her expression never changed and her breathing stayed slow. And even when she finally reached the inspection table, the official behind it was a tall, thin being with gray skin and 4 arms and eyes that sat on stalks extending from the top of its head. "Place your weapon on the table for inspection," the official said in a bored voice that suggested he'd same words 1,000 times. Already today, Elena set her case down and unlatched the clasps and opened the lid. And the official stared at what was inside with an expression that slowly shifted from boredom to confusion to what might have been disbelief. The rifle inside was old, and that was obvious to anyone who looked at it. But old did not begin to describe what this weapon represented in a galaxy where targeting computers could calculate 1,000 variables in the time it took to blink. There was no quantum targeting array, and there was no atmospheric compensation module, and there was no neural link scope that would connect directly to the shooter's brain and feed them perfect targeting data. There was just a long barrel made of steel and a stock made of polymer and a scope made of glass and metal that required the shooter to actually look through it with their own eyes and make their own calculations. The officials' eye stalks bent toward each other in what Elena had learned was a sign of extreme confusion among the species. "Is this your weapon?" the official asked solely, as if perhaps there had been some mistake and the real weapon was hidden somewhere else. "Yes," Elena said simply. "This is a chemical propellant weapon," the official said, and now other cadets were starting to gather around because word was spreading that something unusual was happening at the inspection table. "It is," Elena agreed. "With optical sighting only," the official continued, its voice rising slightly. "No computer assistance of any kind." "That is correct." The Dasari cadet named Rex had pushed his way to the front of the growing crowd, and his bioluminescent stripes were now flashing bright yellow, which indicated barely controlled amusement. "Is that thing powered by fire?" Rex asked loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Do you have to rub sticks together to make it work?" Laughter rippled through the crowd, and Elena simply began removing her rifle from the case and assembling it with movements so smooth and practiced that her hands seemed to work without any conscious direction from her. Mind, she did not respond to the mockery, and she did not look up at the faces that were laughing at her, and she did not show any sign that she was bothered by any of this, because the truth was that she was not bothered at all from the shadow of the range tower that overlooked the inspection area. A figure watched the scene unfold with great interest. Instructor Voss was a Kovasi, a species known for producing some of the most dangerous warriors in the galaxy, and he had lost his left arm to a hegemony assassin 20 years ago and had replaced it with a mechanical limb that was more precise than any organic arm could ever be. He had trained marksmen for 3 decades and had seen every kind of shooter imaginable, and had long ago stopped being impressed by fancy equipment or bold claims, but he had read the file on Private First Class Elena Vasquez, and what he had read had made him request a personal copy of her service record, which he had studied late into the night while everyone else slept. Now he watched as she finished assembling her primitive rifle and held it with a comfort and familiarity that spoke of countless hours of practice, and he saw the way her eyes moved constantly, taking in details about her environment that most people would never notice. "Something interesting about that one?" asked a voice beside him, and Voss turned to see his assistant instructor approaching with a tablet in her hands. "Perhaps," Voss said quietly, his eyes still fixed on the human woman, who was now calmly packing her rifle back into its worn case, while aliens 3 times her size laughed and pointed at her primitive equipment. "The Verdani are favored to win again this year," his assistant said. "Their new targeting systems are supposed to be revolutionary." Voss made a non-committal sound and watched as Elena walked away from the inspection table with her head held high and her steps unhurried despite the mockery that followed her. "We will see," he said softly. "We will see what happens when we test skill against technology." He had a feeling that this year's trials were going to be very different from anything the Academy had seen before, and as he watched Elena disappear into the crowd of cadets, he found himself looking forward to it. The laughter would not last forever, he was certain of that. The morning of the first trial arrived with a cold wind that swept across the firing range and made the flags at the top of the range tower snap and flutter. Like living things trying to escape, Elena stood at her assigned position with her rifle already assembled and resting on its bipod, and she breathed slowly while watching the way the wind moved through the tall grass that grew beyond the first row of targets. All around her, the other cadets were preparing their weapons, and the air was filled with the soft hum of targeting computers powering up and the quiet clicks of neural links, establishing connections between rifles and the minds of their users. The first trial was supposed to be simple, according to the instructors who had briefed them all the night before, with stationary targets placed at increasing distances, starting at 100 meters and extending all the way out to 800 meters. Simple was a relative term, of course, because what was simple for a species with eyes that could track individual dust particles across a kilometer was not simple at all for a human whose visual acuity was considered mediocre by galactic standards. Gethril was positioned 3 stations to Elena's left, and she could hear him making comments to the cadets around him about how this trial would demonstrate once and for all why humans did not belong at an elite academy like this one. "Watch closely," he said loudly, "and you will see what a real marksman can do with proper equipment." The signal to begin was a single tone that echoed across the range, and immediately the air was filled with the sharp sounds of advanced weapons firing and the soft confirmations of targeting computers announcing successful hits. Elena did not rush, because rushing was the enemy of accuracy, and her grandfather had taught her that lesson when she was 7 years old, standing in the mountains of Earth with a rifle that felt almost too heavy for her small arms to hold. She looked through her scope and made small adjustments with dials that required her fingers to turn them manually, and she calculated the distance to the first target in her head using reference points she had memorized during the briefing. Her first shot was good and her second shot was good, and she moved through the course at a steady pace that was neither fast nor slow, while around her the alien cadets with their advanced weapons blazed through targets at speeds that would have seemed impossible to anyone watching when the first trial ended. The results were displayed on a large screen at the front of the range, and Elena found her name somewhere in the middle of the rankings with scores that were adequate but certainly not impressive. Ekerl had finished near the top as expected, and his targeting computer had helped him achieve a nearly perfect score with hits that were measured in fractions of millimeters from the center of each target. The human performed adequately for a primitive. Gethril announced to his group of admirers, "Perhaps she can serve as our ammunition carrier during the team exercises." More laughter followed, and Elena simply began cleaning her rifle with a soft cloth while showing no reaction to the words that were clearly meant for her to hear. The second trial began 2 hours later, and this time the parameters were very different. Targets would be moving, and the wind would be variable, and there would be sensory disruptors cycling through frequencies, designed to test how well each shooter could perform when their equipment was being actively interfered with. This was meant to simulate real combat conditions where the enemy would be using electronic warfare to blind and confuse opposing forces, and where only the most adaptable soldiers would survive. Elena took her position again, and this time she noticed that Instructor Voss had moved from his usual spot in the tower to a location much closer to the firing line, where he could observe individual shooters more directly. The trial began, and within minutes everything changed. Sensory disruptors activated, and suddenly the air was filled with the sounds of cadets cursing in a dozen different languages as their targeting computers began to malfunction, and their neural links fed them corrupted data that made accurate shooting nearly impossible. Gethral's compound eyes were designed to work with his targeting system, and when that system began showing him phantom trajectories and false target locations, he found himself unable to separate reality from the lies his equipment was telling him. The Vasari cadet named Vrex watched in horror as his rifle sparked and went completely dead in his hands, the victim of an electromagnetic pulse that his weapons shielding should have blocked, but somehow did not, all across the firing line. The most sophisticated weapons in the galaxy were failing their users, and cadets who had never learned to shoot without computer assistance were discovering that they had no idea how to hit a moving target using only their own senses. Lena's rifle had nothing to corrupt because there was nothing electronic inside it, and her scope was just glass, and her targeting system was just her brain, and these things could not be jammed or hacked or confused by any disruptor ever invented. She dropped into a prone position with a fluid movement that spoke of thousands of hours of practice, and she adjusted her scope using the manual dials, and she began to read the field in front of her, the way her ancestors had read the hunting grounds of ancient Earth. The wind was moving from left to right at approximately 12 kilometers per hour, but there was a thermal updraft near the 300-meter mark that would push rounds high if she did not compensate for it. The grass was bending in patterns. That told her exactly how the air was moving, and the dust rising from the ground showed her where the wind was stronger and where it was weaker. She fired once, and a target at 400 meters fell, and she adjusted slightly and fired again, and another target dropped, and she found a rhythm that was ancient and primal and had nothing to do with computers or calculations made by machines. 3 shots and 4 targets were down because one of her rounds had passed through a target at 600 meters and continued on to strike another target that had been moving behind it. The other cadets had stopped trying to shoot and were now watching her with expressions that ranged from disbelief to something that might have been fear. Instructor Voss appeared behind the group of observers without making a sound, which was remarkable for a being of his size, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried clearly to everyone present. "How is she compensating for the wind shear?" someone asked. "She is not using compensation," Voss replied. "She is reading it directly with her eyes and her mind in the way that humans learn to do. When their survival depended on killing prey from distances, their bodies could not close." He paused and watched as Elena made another shot that should have been impossible, hitting a target that was moving laterally at 600 meters, while every computerized system on the range was still trying to recalibrate itself. Her people call this fieldcraft, and they developed it over millions of years of evolution when they were prey as often as they were predators, and the only advantage they had was the ability to think and adapt faster than the creatures hunting them. Catherall had lowered his malfunctioning rifle and was staring at the human woman with his compound eyes showing an emotion he had never associated with humans before. It was respect, and it was mixed with something else that took him a moment to identify. It was the beginning of fear. Trial ended, and when the scores were displayed, Elena's name had moved from the middle of the rankings to a position near the very top, and the cadets who had laughed at her primitive rifle were no longer laughing. Voss watched the human woman pack her equipment away with the same calm efficiency she had shown throughout the trial, and he nodded slowly to himself because he had been right about her. Trials were about to become very interesting indeed. The mess hall was crowded that evening, and the noise of 100 different conversations in a dozen different languages filled the air with a constant buzz that made it difficult to think. Elena sat alone at a small table in the corner with a tray of food in front of her that she ate slowly while her eyes moved around the room, taking in details that most people would never notice. She saw which species sat together and which avoided each other, and she noticed the small gestures and glances that revealed the complex social dynamics of this place where the best soldiers from across the galaxy had gathered to prove themselves. Carol entered the mess hall with a group of his admirers following behind him, and the room grew quieter as people turned to watch because everyone knew that the Vardani sergeant had been humiliated during the second trial, and everyone was wondering what he would do about it. His compound eyes scanned the room until they found Elena sitting alone in her corner, and then he walked directly toward her with steps that were heavy and deliberate and meant to show that he was not afraid. The cadets at nearby tables moved their chairs to give him room because nobody wanted to be caught between a Vardani warrior and the target of his attention. Elena continued eating without looking up, even when Catherall stopped directly in front of her table and stood there waiting for her to acknowledge him. "Human," he said finally when it became clear that she was not going to speak first. "Sergeant," Elena replied without raising her eyes from her food. Today was an anomaly caused by equipment failure and nothing more, Catherall said loudly enough for everyone in that section of the mess hall to hear. "Under normal conditions, my weapon systems would have performed flawlessly, and your primitive skills would have been meaningless." Elena took another bite of her food and chewed it slowly before swallowing and finally looking up at the massive alien standing over her. "If you say so," she said simply. This response seemed to irritate Catherall more than an argument would have. and his hands clenched into fists at his sides, while his compound eyes flickered with colors that indicated anger among his species. "I propose a challenge," he said. "A single shot at maximum range under perfect conditions with no disruptors or interference of any kind. And the loser will surrender their weapon to the winner as a trophy." The mess hall had gone completely silent now, and every eye was focused on the small human woman and the towering Verdani warrior who was challenging her. Lena set down her eating utensil and looked at Kethral with an expression that gave away nothing about what she was thinking. "Your rifle is worth more than I earn in 5 years of military service," she said, "and mine is held together with tape in some places, so this does not seem like a fair wager. I do not want your rifle." Kethral replied with contempt dripping from every word. "I want to humiliate you in front of everyone here so that they will stop talking about today as if it meant anything important." Elena was quiet for a long moment, and then she nodded once and said, "I accept your challenge." The range master set the parameters for the challenge. The following morning, with the sun just beginning to rise over the distant mountains and casting long shadows across the firing range, the target would be placed at 2,000 meters, which was beyond the effective range of most standard military weapons and would require exceptional skill, even with the most advanced targeting systems available. The target itself was small, roughly the size of a fruit that grew on Earth called an apple, and hitting it would require precision that most shooters could only dream of. To make matters even more difficult, the shot would have to cross a deep canyon where thermal currents created unpredictable air movements that could push a projectile off course by meters if the shooter did not account for them perfectly. Cadets from every species had gathered to watch, and the viewing platforms were packed with bodies pressing against each other to get a better view of what everyone was calling the most anticipated event of the entire trial. Kethral went first, as was his right as the one who had issued the challenge. His rifle was a masterpiece of Verdani engineering, worth more than some starships, and equipped with systems that could calculate thousands of variables per second and adjust the shot in real time. Based on data from dozens of sensors, he settled into his shooting position with the calm confidence of someone who had made shots like this hundreds of times before, and his targeting computer hummed quietly as it began analyzing the wind patterns and thermal currents and gravitational variations that would affect the trajectory of his round. He took his time because there was no reason to rush, and the AI inside his rifle was patient and would tell him exactly when the perfect moment arrived. The moment came and he fired, and the round crossed the canyon in a fraction of a second and struck the target 3 centimeters to the left of dead center. It was an incredible shot by any standard, and the crowd erupted in cheers and applause, and Kethral stood up with a satisfied expression on his face because he knew that he had just set a mark that would be nearly impossible to beat. Elena walked to the firing line without hurrying, and the crowd grew quiet again as they watched her settle into position with her ancient rifle that had no computer and no sensors and no AI to tell her when to shoot. She pressed her cheek to the stock and looked through her simple glass scope at a target that was so far away it was barely visible even with magnification. And then she became very still. Minutes passed and nothing happened, and the crowd began to grow restless because they did not understand what she was waiting for. Rex, the Dazari cadet, leaned toward a companion and whispered, "Perhaps she is frozen with fear and cannot make herself pull the trigger." But Instructor Voss was watching from his position near the range tower, and he knew exactly what Elena was doing. She was not frozen, and she was not afraid. She was waiting and watching and feeling the world around her in a way that no computer could ever replicate. Her eyes tracked the movement of dust particles rising from the canyon floor, and her mind calculated how the thermal currents were shifting moment by moment. She felt the rhythm of the wind against her skin and noticed patterns that were invisible to anyone who had not spent years learning to read the subtle Language of moving air, she saw a bird flying across the canyon and watched how its path curved and dipped in response to air currents that no sensor could detect, and somewhere deep in her mind, in the part that had been shaped by millions of years of human evolution, she knew that the moment was almost here. Her finger touched the trigger with pressure so light it would not have moved a feather. The bird reached a certain point in its flight, and the dust rose in a specific pattern, and the wind shifted by a fraction of a degree. Elena fired. The sound was simple and sharp. Just the crack of a chemical propellant igniting and pushing a metal projectile through a steel barrel, without any of the electronic whine that accompanied modern weapons across the canyon. 2,000 meters away, the target exploded into pieces as the round struck it dead center with precision that should have been impossible. The quality silence that followed was absolute and complete, and seemed to stretch on forever. Then someone in the crowd made a sound that might have been a gasp or a prayer. And suddenly, everyone was talking at once in voices that ranged from disbelief to something close to terror. Stood frozen in place with his compound eyes fixed on the empty space where the target had been, and his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. "That is impossible," he said finally. The wind patterns alone would require calculations that no organic brain could perform in real time. Instructor Voss had moved to stand near the Verdani sergeant, and when he spoke his voice was calm but carried a weight that made everyone nearby fall silent to listen. She was not calculating, Voss said. She was feeling and intuiting in ways that humans have been practicing since before your species developed space travel. He looked at the small human woman, who was now standing up from her shooting position with the same calm expression she always wore. They call it instinct, and they built it from a million years of being the most persistent hunters their world ever produced. And that instinct never disappeared, no matter how much technology they developed. Elena walked to where Kethral stood and looked up at him without any trace of triumph or mockery in her eyes. "Keep your rifle," she said quietly. "I do not need it." Then she turned and walked away while the crowd parted before her like water flowing around a stone, and Kethral watched her go with an expression that had finally lost all traces of contempt. He was looking at her now the way he would look at any worthy opponent, with respect. The observation deck was empty, except for Elena, who sat on a metal bench with her rifle disassembled on a cloth spread before her, and her hands moving through the familiar routine of cleaning and oiling each component. The stars above Vesser Prime were different from the stars she had grown up watching on Earth, but the darkness between them was the same, and she found comfort in that darkness the way she always had. She heard footsteps approaching long before most people would have noticed them, and she recognized the slightly uneven rhythm that came from Instructor Voss walking with his mechanical arms swinging differently than an organic limb. Would he settled his considerable bulk onto a bench nearby without asking permission, and for a long moment neither of them spoke while Elena continued her work and Voss watched the stars. "You held back during the first trial," he said finally, and his voice made it clear that this was not a question, but a statement of fact that he expected her to confirm. Elena's hands did not pause in their work as she replied, "You read my file." "I did," Voss said, "and what I read kept me awake for most of the night because I could not stop thinking about what it meant." He shifted his weight on the bench, and his mechanical arm made a soft whirring sound as it adjusted to his new position. 47 confirmed kills during the Proxima insurgency, he continued, with 17 of those kills occurring at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters, and 4 of them happening during active jamming conditions that should have made precision shooting completely impossible. Elena picked up a worn component and held it up to the starlight to examine it more closely while she listened. "The enemy soldiers started calling you Ghost because they believed you could not be real," Voss said. They thought you were some kind of automated system, or perhaps a story invented to explain losses that made no sense to them. I was just doing my job. Elena said quietly. You missed on purpose during the first trial, Voss pressed. Why would you do that when you had nothing to prove and everything to gain by showing your true abilities from the beginning? Elena was silent for a long time, and when she finally spoke, her voice was distant, as if she was talking about memories. That belonged to someone else. My grandfather taught me to shoot when I was 7 years old, she said. We would go into the mountains near our home on Earth, and he would bring his old rifle that had belonged to his father and his father before that. She held up the component she had been cleaning and looked at it with an expression that was almost tender. He used to say that the gun is just a tool and that the real weapon is the person holding it. She continued. He said that if you depend too much on your equipment, then you will be helpless when your equipment fails. Voss nodded slowly because he had seen this truth play out many times during his decades as a soldier and instructor. I have watched what happens when people think technology makes them invincible, Elena said. They stop thinking for themselves, and they stop adapting to new situations because they expect their computers to do all of that for them. She began reassembling her rifle with movements that were so automatic she did not need to look at what her hands were doing. And when the technology fails, as it always does eventually, those people die, she said. They die confused and helpless because they never learned how to survive without the machines telling them what to do. And you wanted to see if the cadets here understood that lesson. Voss said. Elena nodded and slid the bolt of her rifle home with a satisfying click. I wanted to see if they could learn it, she said. Most species in the galaxy have had advanced technology for so long that they have forgotten what it means to survive without it. But humans have not forgotten because we are still close to our past. She turned to look at Voss directly for the first time since he had arrived. We are only a few hundred years removed from killing each other with sharpened metal, she said. That memory is still in our blood and our bones, and it makes us different from every other species I have encountered. Voss was quiet for a moment, and then he said, the hegemony is moving on the outer colonies, and the war that everyone pretends is not coming is definitely coming. I know, Elena said. When it comes, all of those sophisticated weapon systems are going to face electronic warfare beyond anything we have trained for. Voss continued. The hegemony has been developing jamming technology for decades, and they believe that it will give them an overwhelming advantage. I know that too. Voss leaned forward and his organic eye fixed on Elena with an intensity that would have made most people uncomfortable. Is that the real reason you came here? He asked. To this academy where the best soldiers from across the galaxy come to prove themselves. Elena stood up and cradled her rifle in her arms, the way a parent might hold a child. I came here to teach them how to fight like humans, she said. Because when everything else fails and the computers go dark and the AI systems go mad and all of their beautiful technology turns into useless scrap, they need to know how to put a round on target using nothing but their eyes and their hands. And their will to survive. She looked at Voss with an expression that was calm but carried something powerful beneath the surface. Can you help me do that? She asked. Voss stood up slowly and extended his mechanical arm toward her. And after a moment, Elena shifted her rifle to one hand and clasped his metal fingers with her flesh and blood ones. I think, Voss said with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. That is exactly what this galaxy needs. They stood there for a moment with their hands clasped and an understanding passing between them that did not need words to express. The other instructors will resist, Voss said. They have spent their careers teaching cadets to rely on technology, and they will not easily accept that this approach might be wrong. Then we will have to show them, Elena said, the same way I showed Kethril and the others today. By winning, Voss said. By surviving, Elena corrected him. Winning is what happens when you survive long enough to see your enemies fall, and survival is what humans have been Practicing since the beginning of our existence. She released his hand and began walking toward the door that led back inside the academy building. The final trial is in 3 days, she said without turning around. I want to lead a squad, and I want Kethril and Vrex on my team. The ones who mocked you the most, Voss said with surprise in his voice. They are the ones who need to learn this lesson the most, Elena replied. And when they learn it, they will teach others, and eventually, everyone will understand what it means to fight like a human. She paused at the door and looked back at Voss, who was still standing by the benches with starlight reflecting off his mechanical arm. My grandfather had another saying, she said. He used to tell me that the purpose of strength is not to defeat the weak, but to make the weak become strong. Then she was gone, and Voss was alone on the observation deck with the alien stars shining down on him and a feeling in his chest that he had not experienced in many years. It was hope that when the war came, the galaxy would have soldiers who could fight in the darkness, soldiers who had learned from humans how to be weapons themselves. The morning of the final trial arrived with clouds hanging low over the academy and a tension in the air that made everyone speak in quieter voices than usual. Elena stood in the pre-deployment bay with her squad gathered around her, and she looked at each of them in turn, seeing not the aliens who had mocked her a few days ago, but soldiers who were ready to learn a new way of fighting. Kethril stood at her right with his compound eyes focused on her face, and all traces of his former contempt replaced by an attention that bordered on eagerness. Rex the Dasari was beside him with his bioluminescent stripes glowing a steady green that indicated calm focus and readiness. 3 other cadets completed the squad, each chosen by Elena because she had seen something in them during the earlier trials that suggested they could adapt to what she was about to teach them. Your technology is an advantage, Elena said to them, and I am not asking you to throw it away or pretend it does not exist. She paused and looked at each of them again to make sure they were listening. But I am asking you to stop depending on it as if it were the only thing keeping you alive. She continued, today I want you to think about what happens when your equipment fails and your computers lie to you and your neural links feed you corrupted data. What do we do then? Vrex asked. You use your eyes and your ears and your instincts. Elena said, you trust the senses that evolution gave your species over millions of years before anyone invented targeting computers. She reached into a pouch at her belt and pulled out a set of cards with symbols drawn on them in black ink. These are hand signals that humans developed in ancient wars when electronic communication was impossible. She explained, they are simple and they work even when everything else fails. She spent the next 20 minutes teaching them the basic signals and making them practice until they could communicate silently with reasonable accuracy. Then the signal came that the trial was beginning, and they moved out together into a landscape that had been designed to test every skill a soldier might need in combat. The trial was a live-fire exercise with multiple objectives and team-based scoring. And within the first hour, the Academy instructors had deployed electronic countermeasures that rendered most advanced optics completely useless. Squads with the most sophisticated equipment floundered as their targeting systems crashed and their communication networks went dead, and their soldiers found themselves unable to function without the technology they had always taken for granted. But Elena's squad moved through the chaos like a single organism, with each member knowing exactly where the others were and what they were doing without needing to speak a word. Kethril discovered that his compound eyes, freed from the distraction of malfunctioning heads-up displays, could track movement across the battlefield with a precision that startled even him. He'd always relied on his targeting computer to tell him where enemies were hiding, but now he realized that his own natural vision was capable of detecting details that no artificial system could match. Vrex found that his bioluminescent stripes could be controlled to produce specific patterns of light that served as signals visible only to his teammates who knew what to look for. He had spent his whole life thinking of his species natural light production as nothing more than an expression of emotion. But now he saw that it was a tool that evolution had given him, and that he had never thought to use. The other members of the squad made similar discoveries about their own natural abilities, finding strengths they had never known they possessed because they had always let machines do the work instead, and Elena moved among them like a ghost, appearing where she was needed and disappearing again before anyone could track her movements. She seemed to be everywhere at once, her shots coming from angles that made no sense to enemies who were desperately trying to get their targeting systems back online. She was not using any scanner or sensor to find her targets because she did not need them. She was reading the battlefield, the way her ancestors had read the hunting grounds of prehistoric Earth, seeing patterns in the movement of dust and the bending of grass and the behavior of small creatures that fled from approaching danger. Enemy squad tried to set an ambush at a narrow passage, and Elena saw it coming before they had finished taking their positions. She signaled to Kethro, who flanked left, while Vrex created a distraction with a carefully controlled burst of light that drew enemy attention at exactly the wrong moment. The ambush failed and the enemy squad was eliminated, and Elena's team moved on without losing a single member. When the trial ended 4 hours later, the results were displayed on screens throughout the academy, and the numbers told a story that no one had expected. Elena's squad had achieved a perfect score, the first in the 400-year history of the Joint Galactic Military Academy. That evening, Instructor Voss stood before a gathering of all the Academy's senior instructors with a tactical display showing Elena's movements during the exercise. "This is what humans call the fog of war," he said. "It refers to the uncertainty that exists in all combat situations and that no amount of technology can completely eliminate." He highlighted a specific moment in the recording where Elena had made a shot through a gap in cover that had existed for exactly 1 1/3 seconds. Most species have spent centuries trying to eliminate this uncertainty with better sensors and better computers and better predictive algorithms. Voss continued, but humans took a different approach. He turned to face his colleagues with an expression that was more serious than any of them had ever seen. "Humans learned to live in the fog," he said. "They learned to make it their home, and to use it as a weapon against enemies who could not function without perfect information." He pulled up Elena's service record and displayed it for everyone to see. "The hegemony believes that their technological superiority will crush our forces when the war begins," he said. "They have run countless simulations and calculated the odds, and they are certain of victory." He paused and looked at the image of the quiet human woman who had transformed the Academy's understanding of what was possible. "They have not calculated for this," he said. "For soldiers who treat every technological failure as an opportunity rather than a disaster. For warriors who have never forgotten that combat is ultimately about one will imposing itself upon another through superior violence and cunning." He straightened to his full height and his mechanical arm gleamed in the light. "I recommend that we make her methods standard curriculum," he declared. "When the war comes, we will need soldiers who can fight when the computers fail and who can win when winning should be impossible." The senior instructors looked at each other and then at the display showing what Elena and her squad had accomplished, and slowly, one by one, they nodded their agreement. In the months that followed, Elena Vasquez began training a new generation of soldiers from across the galaxy. She taught them to read wind patterns and terrain features the way her grandfather had taught her in the mountains of Earth. She taught them to calculate trajectories in their heads and to trust instincts that evolution had spent millions of years perfecting. She taught them that technology was a tool and not a crutch, and that the real weapon was always the person holding the gun. And when the hegemony finally launched their invasion with sensor-blinding weapons and eye-killing viruses and absolute certainty that their technological superiority would guarantee victory, they found themselves facing something they had never anticipated: an enemy that did not need technology to kill them, and an enemy that had been practicing the art of death since before they climbed down from the trees. An enemy that was human, and that had taught every other species in the Alliance to fight the same way. The legend of the ghost spread through the ranks of the hegemony, like a disease carried on the wind. A shooter who never missed no matter what jamming systems were deployed against. Hero warrior who could not be blinded or predicted or stopped by any technology the hegemony possessed. Some said she was a myth created to explain defeats that made no tactical sense. But the soldiers who survived encounters with her knew the truth. She was just a human, and that was the most terrifying thing of all, because if one human could do what she did, then any human could learn to do the same, and there were billions of them scattered across the galaxy, each one carrying the same ancient instincts in their blood, each one capable of becoming a weapon that no technology could defeat. The laughter that had greeted Elena Vasquez when she first arrived at the academy was now a distant memory. In its place was something else, something that spread from species to species as they watched humans fight and learned to fight. Beside them, it was respect, and it was fear, and most of all, it was a new understanding of what humanity really was not. A young and primitive species struggling to keep up with their more advanced neighbors, but the descendants of the most successful predators their world had ever known. Predators who had never stopped hunting and who never, ever missed